Cherry Hills, Colorado, 1981. The body of 34-year-old Sylvia Quayle discovered by her own father in her home.
He opens the front door. He sees that she is on the ground. She's naked from the waist down. Her shirt is pulled violently over her head, pinning her arms. And at that point in time, she has a cloth thrown on her face.
Once police arrive, they discover Sylvia not only sex assaulted, but murdered, shot in the head, and stabbed in the back. The small town of Cherry Hills is reeling, shaken by the violent crime.
This is the only murder that has ever happened in this small town. It's a city that's right outside of Denver, but it's not a place where people get murdered.
This is the story of Sylvia Quayle and how, after 40 years, groundbreaking forensic technology finally solves the mystery of her murder. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Bloodline Detectives. Cherry Hills, Colorado, a small town about 10 miles south of Denver.
It's a place where you find a lot of big homes, a lot of people who are very wealthy, and it's just not a place where you would see a lot of crime, especially back in the 1980s. And that's why when this murder happened, when Sylvia Quayle was killed, it really shocked the community.
She was wonderful. She kind of took me under her wing. She always made sure that we confided in each other and we were like friends. Sylvia was very loving, very caring, loved my parents. She was close to my parents and always wanted to take care of them. That was part of the reason why she wanted to live next door to them. So they were getting ready to retire when she was killed, and she used to cook meals for them and that sort of thing.
August 3, 1981. Just before they go to bed, Sylvia Quayle and her sister Jo talk on the phone. It would be the last time they ever speak to each other.
She speaks to her sister that evening just before going to bed. The next morning, though, her father comes over because typically they have coffee together every morning, and he finds her in a terrible state. He opens the front door. He sees that she is on the ground. Her legs are spread open. She's naked from the waist down. Her shirt is pulled violently over her head, pinning her arms. And at that point in time, she has a cloth thrown on her face. When the dad gets there, he was obviously embarrassed and ashamed and horrified at what he saw. And so he moved the cloth from her face down to her vaginal area. And when the police get on scene, they're able to move the cloth back up to her face to recreate the scene as it was.
She had suffered stab wounds, she had suffered a gunshot wound, and of course she had been sexually assaulted, so her clothing was off.
They called in all their troops, everybody they really could, to help process this crime scene. They also brought in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, what we call CBI, really the forensic experts at the time, and they were the ones that really led the charge on collecting the physical evidence at the scene.
When investigators got there, it was pretty clear what happened, that this was a murder tied to a sexual assault. And what the rest of the house showed is that this person snuck in through a window. It looks like he popped off a screen, pried open a window, and came through Sylvia's house.
It appears that at some point the assailant might have even fired a shot through the window and actually struck Sylvia Quayle in the head with what later turned out to be a .22 caliber bullet.
Cherry Hills police began to establish a timeline from the night before. One thing is immediately clear. Sylvia Quayle's killer made it a point to stop her from calling for help.
The telephone wires had been torn down outside. So the individual used a hose to go up along over the telephone lines and tore them down. So Sylvia would not have been able to contact anyone by phone.
This is the first and only recorded murder in the small town of Cherry Hills. The local police department looks to outside agencies for help.
They walked around the house and they could tell there was some movement with Sylvia. Specifically, when they got to her bedroom, they saw a big pool of blood on top of her pillow. And the pillow in the bed sort of backs up to a window. And they saw that that window was open about 2 to 3 inches. And through that window, there was a small bullet hole protruding not only through the screen, but also through the curtains. They assume that's the first action that the killer took, was that he shot her in the head once, maybe twice. Because from there you can see blood tracing from her bedroom, then into the living room. Where she's ultimately found is in the living room.
Police continue to focus on the crime scene. Investigators have theories, but not much evidence to back them up. Meanwhile, Sylvia Quayle's father remains traumatized.
My mother and I just kind of watched him retreat into himself over the years. It was very hard for him. My mother, on the other hand, she and I talked about the crime and all that, and it was therapeutic for us, but we could never get my dad to talk about it. And as time went by and the crime was not solved, we didn't have any idea who did this. And, you couldn't help but looking at everybody you knew and wondering if they did it. I mean, that's a terrible thing to say, but you just couldn't help wondering who did it.
A violent killer on the loose, a small town living in fear. Hard evidence, hard to come by. Can police catch a killer before he strikes again? That's next on Bloodline Detectives. 1981, Arapahoe County, Colorado. The mutilated body of Sylvia Quayle, age 34, discovered by her dad at her Cherry Hills home. Sylvia, sex attacked, shot in the head, and stabbed in the back. Her brutal attack has the community in shock. Especially chilling, the fact that the killer cut the phone lines coming from Sylvia's home before he makes his escape.
There was a lot of notable things that they found. Of course, they found Sylvia's body, and they collected the carpet underneath her buttocks. So basically the place where, if there had been an assailant that had left something behind, and at the time they're not talking about DNA, but if the assailant had left something behind, they might find evidence of it on that carpet.
They didn't just collect obvious items from her body. They took windows, window frames. They went to great detail to take fingerprints, anything that could have been potential evidence.
In those days, though, they weren't looking for DNA. They were looking for different sources of serology. So they call them robust sources, which are our bloods, our saliva, our semen.
Arapahoe County sheriffs have very little evidence from the crime scene. They hope the results of Sylvia Quayle's autopsy will give them a much-needed break.
What they found was that she had at least 1 or 2 gunshots to the top of her head from a smaller caliber weapon, and then she had 3 stab wounds in her back. But the rest of her body, it was bruised all over. It was bloody. She had some bruises around her neck. She had bruisings on her elbows and her knees and her waist and her hips, and it was clear that she had gone through hell that night.
Sylvia Quayle's autopsy determines she actually dies from the stab wounds, not the gunshot. The coroner also retrieves DNA, but in 1981, identifying that DNA is impossible. In the meantime, it's back to basics for investigators. They build a list of people, mostly men, who knew Sylvia Quayle.
There weren't eyewitnesses, there weren't ear witnesses to what happened. So they talked with Sylvia's friends and tried to develop perhaps a motive for someone wanting to do this. And frankly, throughout those initial years and then in the 20 years or so until they developed a DNA profile, there were many suspects.
You always start with who you know. Generally, you work what we call inside out. meaning those closest to someone, whether it be a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a spouse, coworkers, anyone that could obviously have a connection. I know the original investigation, they interviewed uncles of Sylvia's, family members, associates of Sylvia's.
A lot of people they tracked down, a lot of people they asked to do lie detector tests across the board. Ultimately, none of those suspects really panned out though. While some of them may have had motive, none of them matched the profile that was on the scene. None of them had the correct blood type for what they developed in the 90s.
Does she have anybody that she doesn't get along with? Does she have any ex-boyfriends that potentially would do something like that to her? And actually, she did have a man that she had severed a relationship with who had been abusive to her in the past. So that person then becomes a suspect. And you try to find out where they were at the time that this brutal attack and homicide took place to see if they potentially could be the person that did this to Sylvia Quayle.
Investigators are still building a suspect list when they get surprising news. A death row inmate confesses to the murder of 34-year-old Sylvia Quayle.
Otis Toole is a man who was sentenced to death in Texas, a man who I believe had been convicted of multiple murders, but confessed to almost 100 different murders while he was sitting in jail in Texas. And it became a thing, really, where detectives, troopers, police from all over the country would come and talk to Toole, and they would ask him questions about an unsolved murder, and sure enough, that man would confess to that crime, oftentimes after seeing evidence of the crime, after being shown crime scene photos and being told many of the aspects of the crime.
Mr. Toole decided that the way to keep from being killed, the way to keep from being sent to the penitentiary even, he stayed in this county jail with this sheriff that would provide him with information about different cases that occurred throughout the United States, and he'd pretty much say anything for a pack of cigarettes. In 1993, the DNA that was done on Sylvia Quayle's case proved absolutely that Toole was not involved in any way in killing her. This was a totally false confession, and unfortunately, it slowed the investigation, but at the time, there really were no other leads.
1981, believe it or not, detectives obtain DNA, but at the time, they don't have the right tools to identify it. Fast forward 19 years to 2000, DNA technology has advanced. Investigators enter the DNA sample into the National DNA Database, CODIS.
The technical definition of a cold case is just something unsolved after 3 years. But in this case, because there's not a lot of crime in Cherry Hills Village, this case was looked at all the time. And they actively investigated this case up until the time Otis Toole confessed. And then once he withdrew his confession, we started it up again in our office, probably the late 80s through 1995. That's when we were able to exclude some suspects based on the very first typing of DNA.
There was one early suspect in this case, and it was an ex-boyfriend that Sylvia had been intimate with and had allegedly in the past sexually assaulted her and possibly even broken into her home in the past. So of course, part of the investigation focused on that man.
A DNA sample was taken from him, and his DNA did not match the DNA that was found in the home that was deposited on the body of Sylvia Quayle and on those items around her. That was not his DNA. A good cold case investigator is saying, okay, I don't have any new leads, I don't have any tips, but let's go back to that evidence and see if there's something now that we can learn from that evidence that we've been holding, preserving. As technology advances, that we're getting the latest techniques done on this case. And in 2000, when the testing was done, now they had DNA that could be entered into the national database system. It's called CODIS. It allows a DNA analyst to have a forensic sample from a crime scene compared to individuals that are in that database because they're rapists, murderers, or just criminals. And that database has grown over time. It has multiple millions of people in it. And it runs constantly. So if you do it in 2000 and somebody gets into the database in 2011, you're going to get a match. And that's going to give you a lead and a suspect that you can then potentially prove committed the crime.
Investigators have high hopes for a DNA match, but their optimism turns to disappointment.
That CODIS profile never hit. And really what that means is that the killer was either dead or certainly lying low and not getting into trouble where they would end up in the database themselves.
When a case goes cold, you've run out of investigative leads. You go down every lead that you can, and once that lead is closed, you kind of have to wait. And that's kind of what happened with Sylvia's cases. They investigated everything that they could, and with the DNA in the system and being run on a certain schedule, that's all we could do was just sit and wait for something to pop up. So there was nothing else to do in the case but wait.
The 1981 murder of 34-year-old Sylvia Quayle goes cold, and it stays that way nearly 40 years. Next on Bloodline Detectives, can brand new, groundbreaking scientific DNA technology crack the case and finally bring peace to Sylvia Quayle's family? Arapahoe County, Colorado, 2020. Investigators reopened for the second time the 1981 sex assault and murder of 34-year-old Sylvia Quayle. Their best hope? To use the latest forensic science to identify a DNA sample.
As many years pass and this case remains completely cold, we've got a new scientific advancement in genetic genealogy. A way for us to not rely solely on that database to give us a hit, but to go out and actively search for somebody who might have been responsible, using all the different publicly available genetic genealogy databases out there. And that's what Crime Stoppers and United Data Connect did.
United Data Connect is co-founded by veteran prosecutor, former district attorney Mitch Morrissey, an expert in DNA technology. Morrissey introduced the first DNA evidence used in a criminal trial in Denver.
One of the most important things that happened in this case when they reopened it and the testing was done in 2000, and it was done well, and the young woman who did the DNA analysis in the case is somebody that I knew because she worked in the Denver lab. She knew it was a single male sample that she had in some of the different things that she tested. And as techniques and technology changes, she kept that case in mind. She was now up at a lab in Jefferson County, and we had solved 2 of her cases. And I was just talking to her one time when I was picking up items of evidence, and she said, "You know, Mitch, there is a case in Cherry Hills Village that I worked on when I was at CBI, and that is a perfect case for you guys. That has the amount of DNA you're going to need. It's a single source sample, and I think you can solve that case." And I think the reason she never forgot it is because of the way that Sylvia Quayle died. DNA analysts have hearts too, and those things impact them. And she knew it was a brutal case.
In 2019, the case ultimately had been cold for many years until a couple different agencies got involved. United Data Connect was a newer genetic genealogy company. They partnered with Denver Crime Stoppers and ultimately were reached out to by Cherry Hills Village.
Metro Denver Crime Stoppers had been really looking for ways to be helpful. And one of the things that they landed on was helping provide financial assistance for some of these cold cases and the biological testing that sometimes police departments can't afford. For Metro Denver Crime Stoppers, it was an investment in solving homicides that one was, sort of new technology, and Two was a really good way for them to partner with the community, which they always have.
We had to convince Detective Abeda and the people at Cherry Hills Village that we could step in and help them solve this case. I then started calling the Cherry Hills Village Police Department, specifically Detective Abeda, to see if we could help them solve the case.
With the Metro Crime Stoppers and Data Connect, they work very closely together, and the Metro Crime Stoppers actually was funding some of these cold cases. So we met, we sat down with Crime Stoppers and Data Connect, and we all came to an agreement to let them do their analysis and let them run with the case and see where it led.
And they got together to determine, we have this identifiable profile based on the semen collected from the scene. Now, how do we match that to a person?
It's such a positive development when private companies like Metro Crime Stoppers and United Data Connect become partners and help police departments like the one in Cherry Hills. Their combined efforts rest on a revolutionary forensic new tool, genetic genealogy. This may be the last chance to find Sylvia Quayle's killer. Meanwhile, detectives keep Sylvia's sister, Jo, updated on their progress.
Every year, the Cherry Hills Police Department sent me a letter to tell me what the status of the case was, which was very helpful. They've always been very supportive.
It holds out hope that there's still people that care in law enforcement, and there's still people that are looking, and they're looking every chance they get, and they're using the latest techniques. Detective Abeda, of course, wanted me to meet the police chief, all of his superiors. They were on board. They were trying to solve this case for years. They wanted to do the latest. They didn't really know about it, but we explained it all to them. We sat down and told them what we would do. They were able to then provide me with some of the evidence, and I was able to ship it off, and I got it sequenced. When you sequence DNA, that's different than the techniques that were used in 2000. You can then search commercial databases that are out there. Many people think of Ancestry, 23andMe. Well, there are two. There's one called GEDmatch, and there's one called Family Tree DNA that allow law enforcement to use the DNA of the people that are in there. You find out people that may be related that are in those databases. And what you're looking for is people that are cousins. And on average, people have about 800 cousins out to the fourth cousin range. People that are concerned about us using DNA in these databases to find people they've never even met, people that don't even live in the same town, sometimes don't live in the same state or country, but they are extremely important. They upload their DNA and they say, yes, law enforcement can use it. Then you start to build the family tree down. You've built it up to that most recent common ancestor. Now you're building it down to try to find someone that's living at the time that your crime occurred. So you're looking at wedding announcements. You're looking at obituaries where they name the people that are still left. It's great for our genealogists to then build those family trees.
Mitch Morrissey and his team put the science of genetic genealogy to work. They processed thousands of names looking for a match. Finally, a breakthrough.
In this case, I think we had over 3,000 people in the tree, but we got it down to a point where it was one of two brothers. One was local. He lived in the town and worked in the town right next to Cherry Hills Village. There's a town called Inglewood, which is another small town that is part of the Denver metro area. He lived and worked in that area. The other brother lived in a town in Nebraska, a small town there. Now you've got an investigative lead based on DNA, based on genealogy, and at that point, we give it over to the investigators.
In any cold case, we do a full evidence review as the first thing that I do on any case, to make sure that all the evidence exists that you believe exists, to make sure you know what you're working with. Obviously, a review of the crime scene and the crime scene photos, which of course in this case are extremely brutal.
Two very good investigators in this case. Detective Abeda was still on the case, and he was getting the assistance of the Arapahoe County DA's office. They have a cold case investigator named Matt Hannigan. And between the two of those individuals, they started running down the leads. They were able to get a DNA sample from the brother that was local. The brother had a cup of coffee with a boss of some kind. When he got up to go back to work, he left his cup there. The superior collected it. The DNA that was left on the coffee cup did not match the DNA that was left in the crime scene at Sylvia Quayle. Now we were down to one suspect, and that suspect lived in Nebraska.
I remember being told for the first time that we thought we knew who did it. That man's name was David Anderson. And when I heard that name, of course, he wasn't a name that made any sort of connection to our case files. It wasn't a person who had been interviewed or was a suspect at any point in time. But David Anderson was a man who in the early 1980s had been arrested some 8 times in the Denver metro area, who had been suspected of home break-ins, even breaking into a home through the window, just like Sylvia Quayle's home.
40 years after Sylvia Quayle's brutal murder, Cherry Hill detectives finally have a name: David Anderson. But to be certain Anderson is the killer, they need a DNA sample from him. That's next on Bloodline Detectives. Cherry Hills, Colorado, 2021. Police are closing in on David Anderson, the prime suspect in the 81 murder and sex assault of Sylvia Quayle. Thanks to the science of genetic genealogy, detectives already have a DNA match to Anderson from the original crime scene. But now they need to confirm that match by getting new DNA from him.
My parents were both deceased at that time, so it was just me and my husband. 2 detectives had come to tell me that they had a lead, and then they explained to me a little bit about the forensic genealogy and all that, and how they were trying to narrow it down. And then they contacted me a second time and told me they had narrowed it down to one family.
The town in Nebraska where this suspect was Cozad, Nebraska. It's a small town. We knew where he was. We knew he had a criminal record. We knew he had been in trouble in Colorado as late as 1989. So his criminal record corresponded to around the time that Sylvia Quayle was murdered. And all of the genealogy and DNA was pointing at him. So the question was, who's going to get out there and how are they going to do this?
Working again with United Data Connect, they have investigators, in particular in this case, Bob Fuller, who was a long-time criminal investigator here in the Denver metro area, agrees to go to Cozad, Nebraska, where we now know David Anderson is living. We know he's living with his wife. We know where he works. We are working in coordination with the Dawson County Sheriff's Office.
Bob was an outstanding police officer, and he was an outstanding investigator for the Denver District Attorney's Office. He knew how to do surveillance, he knew how to collect DNA, he knew how to protect people's rights and do it in a constitutional and legal way. He started his surveillance the first day. He also established a rapport with the police department. He found out where the individual was living, if he was married.
Investigator Bob Fuller has one goal and one goal only: to obtain a DNA sample from David Anderson's trash.
It's determined that David Anderson lives in an apartment complex. There is a community trash bin. So you walk down the hall, you go into a trash room essentially. There's a large dumpster, you throw your trash bags in there.
What Bob was able to do then, he talked to the police chief. They got their public works that collect the trash to take the dumpster down to a warehouse where they then went through all of the trash in the dumpster. And what they were able to find were white plastic garbage bags that had been tied and sealed. And in a couple of those bags, there was mail addressed to the individual we were looking for.
He selects items which he knows based on his training experience are good DNA items, which are, cans, bottles, things that you put your lips on. Those items are collected by me and then rushed straight back to the Cherry Hills Village Police Department, where they're turned and sent to the DNA lab. They are rush tested, and on a vanilla Coke can, David Anderson is a 100% match.
When analysts at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation looked into that DNA profile from the Coke can, they found that DNA profile matched to the exclusion of every other living person on this planet. That DNA profile matched the semen that was found inside Sylvia Quayle from her assailant. They found that the semen from the carpet matched the person who had left the DNA profile in the Coke can, matched to David Anderson. They even found that the YSTR profile, now a YSTR profile is really the male profile associated with David Anderson. It's unique to his male lineage. That matched the saliva that was found on her breast. So we had a clear connection to David Anderson, not only as our suspect, but as our killer.
It was time for an arrest.
The DNA match is confirmed. Police moved quickly to arrest David Anderson 40 years after he murdered Sylvia Quayle.
David Anderson's ultimately arrested soon after we get this positive DNA hit, and luckily for us, he agrees to tell his side of the story.
He's brought back to the Dawson County Sheriff's Office to be interviewed by me and Detective Abeda.
So we're from Colorado. We're both detectives. And we're investigating some crimes out there. Your name came up and that you had lived there. So we're out and about trying to talk to people.
Okay.
So obviously that's up to you if you want to talk to us.
Yeah, I don't have nothing to hide.
We showed him a photo of Sylvia in the pile of photos with other people that were just random people that we selected from motor vehicles database who looked similar to Sylvia. He said no to everyone, including Sylvia. I said, well, would it surprise you if your DNA was found on a dead girl? And he said, my first thought would be that I was being set up. And at that time I said, well, let me help you out. It's your semen. He said that the DNA was inside of her before I did.
I don't know what happened. If I did, I guarantee I would tell you. I don't know what happened. I mean, it's obvious if I would say, hey, somebody set me up, that's what's going through my head, but...
Well, we can answer that for you. The DNA is your semen.
Well,
So,
I figured that when you said it was inside her.
I knew at that time he wasn't going to confess. I just felt that Lenny and I weren't going to get any further than we had.
What he told us was interesting because he was stuck with that answer ultimately throughout the trial, but he told us he didn't know Sylvia Quayle, even when confronted with the fact that his DNA was found not only on her, but inside of her. He continued to say he didn't have a consensual relationship with her, he never dated her, he was never at her house, and he didn't know how his DNA got there.
That is almost as good as a confession. When you have the person's DNA in an intimate place like we had in this case, for him to deny that he knew her, that he'd ever been in her house, that he'd ever ejaculated in her house, to deny all those things is very important because the DNA proves he did all of those things.
After the interview, that's when we present him with the search warrant for his DNA, and we take 2 cotton swabs and we rubbed them on the inside of his cheek, and then those are sealed, and when we get back to Denver, we sent them to the lab for a confirmation.
They had the vanilla Coke can profile, which was consistent with all the other DNA profiles they were developing. But really, they wanted to get the buccal swab. When they got the buccal swab from the defendant's cheek, they confirmed it was the defendant, essentially to the exclusion of all other people on the planet or who have ever lived, because the numbers were so astronomically high. And what they found is that every piece of evidence that they tested over the years with different technologies all came back to the same profile, that of David Anderson all these years later. After his arrest, the defendant pled not guilty to the charges. And so he was facing 2 counts of murder. Murder in the first degree by way of premeditation, meaning he planned it, he meant to do this, and murder by means of felony murder, which means during the act of some other crime, in this case sexual assault or burglary, Sylvia Quayle ended up dead.
The Bloodline Detectives believe they've closed the case against David Anderson, but as we see next, his murder trial does not go as planned. March 2022, Arapahoe County, Colorado. David Anderson on trial for the 1981 sex assault and murder of Sylvia Quayle. Anderson has been tracked by investigators to his home in Nebraska. His DNA obtained from a vanilla Coke can in the trash, and it matches the DNA found at the crime scene 41 years earlier.
When Mr. Anderson went to trial, we had everything that you would hope for in a cold case prosecution. You had a clear DNA profile, we had a clear chain of custody, we had evidence putting this man not just through his DNA at the scene, but in the Denver metro area in the early 80s. This was clearly our guy, and we were going to hold him accountable, and we're going to ask a jury to do just that.
Anytime you have a jury trial where 12 people have to agree on something unanimously, it's difficult.
I can tell you, as a former felony prosecutor, no matter how airtight you think your case is, you can never predict what a jury will do. And that is exactly what happened in the trial of David Anderson. His first trial, at least. One juror did not agree with the other members of the jury. The judge had to declare a mistrial. Arapahoe County prosecutors are so confident in their evidence, they strike a new jury almost immediately.
We were told after the fact, because we're not a part of the jury deliberations, that they were heavily leaning towards our side. We retried the case about 3 months later.
We were not going to let this case go cold again. We were not going to let Mr. Anderson escape justice. So we took this case back to trial, convinced a jury of 12 that he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and they returned a verdict of guilty to all charges.
After a 5 or 6 day trial and an hour and a half of deliberation, the jury came back with guilty to both counts of murder. I know the victim's sister was still here, was able to see that verdict. Her father, her mother have not been around for many years, and I think this pained them greatly to not know where their daughter's killer was, to not have any justice in that sense.
Now her family was able to see that the justice system not only kept working this case, but was going to hold him accountable. And at 64, 65 years old, Mr. Anderson is going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. And DNA proved that he deserves to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
When we got the conviction, it was just like this huge weight was lifted off my shoulders. I felt so different. I was so relieved, and I was so filled with gratitude for all the work that these people had done to make this happen. Mitch and his group, the police, Crime Stoppers, all of those people, they all worked together. And I just have nothing but admiration for them and the work that they do. They really looked at my sister as a person, not just a case. And I appreciated that.
In the murder of Sylvia Quayle, Bloodline Detectives reflect on the power of genetic genealogy used to solve Sylvia's murder after 41 years.
Genetic genealogy has taken it to a whole new level for us. And so my message for anybody who thinks they've gotten away with a heinous crime like that, who thinks that just because they've laid low for a number of years, is that we're coming for them. And we've been successful at it before. We're gonna keep doing it until we get them all.
Going through this process with forensic genealogy, people need to know that there is hope. There is a lot of hope to solve these cases.
A vicious, calculated sex attack and murder ignites a family that will never forget, investigators who will not quit, and a partnership of scientists, citizen crime fighters, and law enforcement who all join forces to support the Bloodline Detectives. Genetic genealogy utilized on behalf of Sylvia Quayle's family and hundreds of others growing by the day emerges as a valuable tool to obtain justice. I'm Nancy Grace. Thank you for joining us here on Bloodline Detectives.